Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today on the podcast is an interview I've been trying to schedule for quite a while. And we've been having lots of back and forth things, different reasons for rescheduling, but I'm so happy that we're finally able to do this. And so on the show today, we have Dr. Táhcita, Mizael. Welcome to the show, Táhcita.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, Táhcita's in Brazil. What city are you in?
São Paulo.
São Paulo. Right. Beautiful. And we're going to be talking a lot about all things Brazil and behavior analysis, and some issues that are, close to Dr. Mizael's heart and my own, and really interested to kind of hear the perspectives from on these topics, which I've talked a lot about on the podcast, but not from the Brazilian context, which I think is really important. So, Táhcita, before we kind of get into some of these amazing papers that you wrote, and I imagine you have a lot more amazing papers that I just can't read, but I do really appreciate that you've made and we'll get into this later, but you've made a kind of concerted effort to put out papers in English, in part, I think, to disseminate, but also to to show the world that there's some really cool things happening in Brazil in behavior analysis, and so I'm looking forward to digging into that. But I think you also have a lot of really good stuff in Portuguese. I assume you have a lot of really good stuff in Portuguese. Just looking at some of the titles and some of the books you've written, and so it'll be interesting to kind of touch on some of that stuff too. Before we get into that, maybe you could just kind of tell us how you got into the field of ABA and what led you to kind of really do all this work in kind of the social justice area.
Okay, well, actually, I think it was just luck. I was an undergrad student, and I was in this university in a small city within São Paulo, where I don't know if you know them, but Júlio de Rose and Daisy de Souza are professors and like their main names in the field. And of course, I had no idea. I was just a very young girl learning psychology. Mm-hmm. And so I happened to be in one of the centers of behavior analysis within Brazil without knowing it. And I kind of got into the field, there was that. And also, because I actually struggled a little bit with psychoanalysis, which was the other main thing that we learned. And I had trouble because I've always been a very, a very rational person, and I like variables and I like knowing how things work. And I was learning how to do research within psychology, like qualitative and quantitative research. And I was just struggling to see how psychoanalysis could fit within this way we look at research, experimental research, at least, And so I was like, yeah, that's not for me. And then there's this other thing here. And it was actually great. At first it was just going through exclusion and going to behavior analysis. But then I really loved it because it made sense for me, because I was struggling with theories that were brought from other countries, like Europe, United States, and just not applied to the reality of Brazil. And within behavior analysis, I think we don't have that issue because we have to look at the environment the person is in,
Exactly.
So I was like, yeah, it was developed in the United States, but we can actually think about the reality within Brazil to work with it. So I think it was basically that. And I had the chance, I did an internship. I think I was a second year undergrad student. And so here in Brazil, Júlio and Daisy have developed a very successful learning program. They use stimulus equivalence to teach basic reading skills to students that are falling behind schedule. And I was able to work a little bit with that. And I was like, when I discovered equivalence stimulus, I was like in love with it because for me, it explained everything. And to this day, I'm like, this is just huge. This is just so important. It's a way of looking at things that just makes sense to me. And especially being I was this undergrad student in an university that was white. And I was one of I think there were like 40 students in my class, and there were just me and three other Black people in there. So yeah, it was hard, and I was poor. I mean, I'm poor. I'm still poor, but like being a poor person, a Black person, a woman who's part of the LGBTQIA community, it was just, wow, like it was just hard because it felt like none of what I was learning applied to myself or to the people that are, in the neighborhoods that I grew up with. And when I started learning behavior analysis, I thought that I could actually suit them. Like I can look at this and apply this to any environment that I'm in. And within stimulus equivalence, it was like a similar phenomenon because I was always thinking about prejudice. Mostly, I think, because I was suffering from it. And when I looked at like relations and how people, like develop prejudices and attitudes towards people and then behave accordingly to them, it was just like, yeah, I have a way of looking at this. Like I can design experiments, but I can also look at real world applications. And so it was pretty much what led me to do a master's degree and then pursuing an academic career.
That's cool. There's lots of things to unpack there. I wonder first you might be able to just tell us a bit about sort of ABA in Brazil in general. I mean, I think for me, I'm in Canada, and so we have, this sort of perspective that kind of mirrors the U.S. because we border with them, and so a lot of I think what we learn about ABA is from the U.S. and as I've been kind of doing these podcasts, I've been doing a lot of interviews with folks internationally and just sort of learning about ABA in different countries, and most of the folks I've talked to so far, I mean, I know there's a lot of countries to get to. ABA has been a fairly new thing in their countries, and usually the person I'm interviewing is like one of 3 BCBAs or behavior analysts in their country. It's very new, but it sounds like and that just from sort of and again this is I haven't done my research, but just from sort of I guess ABAI kind of conferences and those sorts of things. That there seems to be a little more happening in ABA in some South American countries and in a few European countries. There seems to be a sort of a bigger history of ABA, but I don't think I had any idea on kind of what it was. You mentioned those 2 folks. I've never heard of those 2 folks, Daisy and who's the other one? Sorry, already forgot. Julio or
Julio de Rosa.
Julio, yeah. So I've never heard of either of those folks, but you say they're 2 huge big names in behavior analysis, and this just shows that maybe I need to get out more. But can you tell me a bit about sort of a short version of sort of the history of ABA in Brazil? Like how long has it been around? Who kind of brought it there, and kind of what the educational opportunities are? And lastly, because I didn't hear you mention autism at all. And usually when I'm talking to folks about ABA, it's usually because they're in the autism field and that gets them in the ABA. So maybe talking a bit about sort of where that fits in Brazil.
Okay. So there's a lot of information.
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. So I think the history of Brazil and behavior analysis is longer because we have literature from the 60s. I think, we had, do you know Fred Keller?
Yes.
So yeah, he went to Brazil and then he helped develop behavior analysis in Brazil. And we have also Carolina Botti, who's a Brazilian. And so in the 60s, we had already laboratories of experimental research within Brazil. And so we have I think we have a bigger history because of that. And yeah, I noticed that too, that sometimes when you're talking about behavior analysis, it's usually autism, but we have that in Brazil as well. But we also have this history with experimental research because of that history, you know. And so what I remember is that, so in the 60s, we had these two main names within behavior analysis, learning and teaching students. And then these students went to other universities and started learning, like teaching behavior analysis to their students as well. And that's how the main centers of behavior analysis developed within Brazil. And I think we have at least five universities with a strong program of research in behavior analysis. And like experimental behavior analysis, not just applied behavior analysis. So yeah, we have this bigger history because of that. And so I think it came from the United States, but it developed over time in here. And that's just like that's a way of summing it up a lot of history.
No, that's good.
Regarding, but when we talk about applied behavior analysis, it usually autism comes to mind. I can't deny that. What I can say is that I think autism is actually the main field when it comes to applied behavior analysis in Brazil. We have a lot of courses within applied behavior analysis that are specific to autism.
Right.
And but this is actually, I have a paper actually that kind of criticizes that, you know, like not exactly, but I mean, personally, I think we should use this to other things as well. And it's not because I don't like the autism research. I mean, I'm autistic and I like some things, I don't like other things, but you know, I can't even say why this is the case, but yes, when it comes to applied behavior analysis, I think autism is just the main field, and perhaps because we have a lot of studies on it, and also there's like a marketing scheme and people make money of it.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna deny that this actually happens. I don't remember what else you asked me to.
No, that's good. So I think that's the big piece, is, and that's probably why, you know, I haven't heard a lot about behavior analysis in Brazil, is because I'm not really in the sort of experimental sort of circles. I you know, my school didn't really do anything in EAB. You know, I think there maybe have been a couple of references here and there, but my program was entirely applied, and you know, I struggle to read, you know, experimental journals and articles. I had a guy on the podcast a while back, one of the early episodes, a guy named Val Saney. He's at one of our universities here in Canada, and he was doing some translational stuff. And that was interesting. That was sort of my first real conversation with anybody about experimental analysis and kind of, you know, how it sort of, you know, applies in ABA and whatnot. And it was really interesting, but it can get really technical and really you know, super jargony, and you know, formulas and all these sorts of things, and it's hard on my brain. But that's interesting that there's a lot of experimental history. The other thing I've noticed that I'm learning, you know, and your papers are really helpful, I think, for putting some of this in context, because I'm still a newbie when it comes to ACT and RFT and that sort of thing, and most of the stuff that I know about both of those areas I learned doing this podcast. You know, I don't really read much beyond the articles that my guests have written. But it looks like there's ACT is a whole other thing, where ACT seems to be international. Like ACT seems to be everywhere. Like it seems to be in every country in the world in some way or another, where behavior analysis might not seem like it's there. There's quite a bit of ACT and ACT practitioners in Brazil. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many there are, but yeah, we have a lot of them that actually study under like names in the United States, like famous people, and then come to Brazil and uses and teaches people. So we have some courses on ACT. Yeah.
Yeah. And you said you have so for a country that's, because Brazil is huge. So Brazil is like 200 million people, something like that. That's not far off from the U.S. I think I read in one of your papers something that was like the fourth or fifth biggest country in the world by population. Behavior analysis has been around since the 60s, and yet you only have 5 universities that focus on this area. Like, how many universities, give or take, are in Brazil? Like, just throw in like hundreds.
Yeah.
So there's lots and lots of universities. Just to give a context of 5. Whereas in Canada, we have like 35 million people, and I think we have 4 universities that do graduate level or above ABA. We have several more that do kind of undergrad stuff. So it just seems like that's not very much in Brazil. Is there a reason why it didn't expand even more? Do you know? Any thoughts?
That's a research question.
Yeah.
I have some hypotheses, but it's hard to like pinpoint a specific reason as to why this is not the case. So I don't know. One of my hypotheses is that like the technical language doesn't help, because we usually talk just with other behavior analysts. We don't talk to other people. And when we talk to other people, we do not do a good job at translating the technical language. And so people are like, what is this person saying, And I think that's a huge problem, because I think we have so much to offer, and at the same time, we close ourselves. Like, we are a field that, that's my impression, of course, but that we are a field that it's not open to other fields, so to learning from others.
Yes.
And also, when there's some type of interchange happening, we struggle to translate what we want to say, like the terms and the technical stuff. So I think it's one of the reasons as to why perhaps it's not more spread throughout Brazil. And perhaps prejudice as well, I think, because to this day, I see, like when you are not in one of these 5 universities with a strong behavior analysis curriculum, you see people talking about behavior analysis, and their understanding is just so poorly, they talk about behavior analysis sometimes as if they were talking about early types of behaviorism, for instance, So it's like, it's just stimulus and response. And, like it's a very basic and ill-informed understanding of things.
Yes.
And then people are like, that's a mechanicistic way of seeing things, like they don't take into account the structures, like when we talk about oppression and gender and social markers and things like that. So I've had some experiences studying in, like, I did a course on gender and sexuality, and it was entirely informed with like sociology studies and other fields, and the class is full of psychologists, and they were like, I don't like behavior analysis because it doesn't take the individual, like everything's just the person and stimulus and response and rats and things like that. And I was like, yes, but no. And it's just, it's hard to explain. Yeah. And when you have the chance to explain, sometimes they don't even give you a chance to explain.
They don't even want to hear it. Yeah. And I think the other thing that makes sort of, the reason why, other countries have so many programs in behavior analysis is because of autism and funding for autism programs.
Yeah.
Is there, and we're not going to get too deep into autism today, but in Brazil, is there funding for autism programs, or like how does that work in general? Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. Homehouse offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, Homehouse has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to whomhouse.com/speak or search Whomhouse on Google. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is collaboration.
I would say I think there is, but actually, when it comes to like graduate programs, I don't recall programs that are focused on autism, or even, I mean, we have courses on applied behavior analysis, but it's just a minority. I think the funding for autism goes mainly to the medical field. But it's just an impression. I mean, it's not based on any data. It's just based on my thoughts.
No, that makes some sense. And I mean, I think that's not uncommon in other countries as well. So just one more kind of question around sort of...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I remember something that I think it might be important.
Yeah.
So here in Brazil, like in the United States, we have the government saying that behavior analysis is the primary treatment for autism.
Yes.
We don't have that in Brazil. So yeah. Perhaps that's an important information. Like we have evidence, of course, of the importance of interventions using behavior analysis, but we don't have that endorsement from the government.
I see. I was just also going to ask, so since your programs aren't primarily, ABA and more experimental, who or maybe why, I'm not really sure what the question is, but why are experimental programs being funded? Like who in Brazil is giving someone a grant to do experimental research in ABA? Like why is there an interest in that? You know what I mean?
Okay, how do I answer that question?
Yeah, well, it wasn't a great question.
I don't think. No. It is a good question. It's just that it's hard to explain because those 5 centers that I've mentioned are public universities. All public universities in Brazil are funded by the government.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I don't think the type of research you do matters. I think just we have some money and you can use it. Like if you have professors that are working on 3 different fields, then you have this money. So it's not, as far as I know, it doesn't really, like, to answer your question, it's just like, it's not that experimental research is being funded, because it's not. It's just that the public universities have money, and if there are behavioral analysts working in these universities, they can use the money to do this type of research. Actually, when you look at some specific funding agencies, we see that tendency to have more funding to applied settings.
And that's not surprising, I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay, really cool. So, actually, maybe I'll ask one more question before we kind of start diving into your research and the topics and kind of why you chose those. You mentioned as well that you're autistic. And which is cool. I mean, you've got a lot of intersecting identities which kind of probably part of the reason why you do some of the research that you're doing, and maybe this is a good segue. But just looking at the autistic identity right now, a couple questions. One, are you sort of a more recently diagnosed, or were you as a child?
No, I was diagnosed in 2020. Like in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a suspicion at some points in my life, but I just disregarded it.
Yeah.
And when the pandemic started, I just like a lot of autistic like behaviors increased in frequency in a way never before experienced. And then I was like, no, I have to know if I'm autistic. Yeah.
And has that been a positive, having the diagnosis for you?
I'm sorry?
Like, has that been a good thing, finding out that you're autistic? Like, has that helped you?
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it explained a lot about my life. And I've never seen it as a bad thing, you know, like what it was bad, it was that it took so long for me to discover that, because there were some specific points in my life where I actually needed some type of support and I didn't have it. And I didn't know I needed and I could have that support, you know. And so that's the only bad thing for me. It was actually very good to get to know myself better, to understand my limits better, and to be able to work in therapy, the things that I struggle the most, but also knowing that there are limitations, you know.
And here's a bit of a no pressure on this question, but curious just if you have any thoughts, because it's quite a conversation in North America, particularly from autistic folks and especially from autistic behavior analysts. There's been a lot of conversation just about ABA in itself and sort of some of the issues with it. I'm curious if you sort of have any thoughts either way, just now that you recognize that you're autistic, and you look at some of these programs for autistic folks. Do you sort of have any thoughts about ABA and maybe in terms of maybe needing some improvement and that sort of thing?
Yeah. I've actually have written a paper on it. It's in Portuguese. Yeah, with a colleague who is also a behavior analyst and autistic as well.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. We mainly talked about some issues that we see within the field, you know, like the lack of autistic people telling practitioners like what they actually need. And so we acknowledge that behavior analysis, you know, applied behavior analysis is good, you know, like it's a good tool, but it has to be applied in a certain way. And people actually have to know not only, you know, like the basis of behavior analysis, experimental stuff that goes behind it, but also that, how do I put this? We are entitled to an opinion, you know, like we are entitled to say like, this is okay, this is not okay. You know, like we're mainly criticizing some people who wants to eliminate, how do I say this in English? How do I say this in English? How do I pronounce this word?
Stereotypes, yeah.
Stereotypes? Okay.
Yep.
You know, like this type of thing, you know, like if you're not hurting anyone, like what's the problem? What's the problem if the person doesn't look you in the eye, you know?
Yeah.
So we were criticizing some things regarding that, like the actions of neurotypical people that are like, yeah, no, you have to be like a neurotypical person. It's like, no, we are not like, you know, we don't have to.
Maybe you meant to say stereotypy. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah. Stereotypy.
Okay.
Yes. The repetitive behaviors. That's what I meant.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And so, I mean, I think this is going to kind of answer my next question, because you do identify with so many, you know, sort of different intersectionalities that are, you know, generally speaking, you know, oppressed in some way, or considered a minority in some way. Probably not just in Brazil, in probably most countries. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about why so much of your work seems to focus on kind of these social justice areas like feminism and racism and so on.
Okay. I think that's probably because of who I am.
Yeah.
And since I was a child, like my parents, they tell me a lot about this, that I was very sensitive to injustices. And so when I saw something, I was like, no, that's not fair. That's not you. I was that kind of child that, no, that's not fair. And I remember things, that are related actually to sexism practices. Like my dad was sitting on his couch, drinking and watching TV. And my mom was like doing the dishes and things like that. And she was like, come help me. I was like, why? Why do I have to, why can't he stay in the couch and you have to do this and I have to do this? So I didn't know at the time that, very feminist thing, but
yes,
I was very sensitive to any type of situation like that. I was like, why is this different? Why aren't people being treated the same? And then I think I grew up and I wanted to make sense of this and make it right some way, I think that's why I got into this, my interests are very concerned with the minorities in general, because it's basically talking about injustice, and that's not fair. So I wanted to tell people that's not fair and try somehow to make it better.
Yeah. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about sort of just kind of Brazil and the demographics. I think a lot of folks understand. I think the George Floyd murder has done and the circumstances surrounding that has done a relatively good job of sort of educating the world around racism in the U.S. And Canada to a lesser extent, I think. But I think for folks like myself who are so distant from a lot of these groups, I particularly, I live in a small village that is 95% white folks. Everybody works in a mine here. They're blue collar workers, that sort of thing. It's very homogeneous, I guess, as far as there's not a lot of diversity here. And so, you hear lots of microaggressions all the time, even if they're not sort of referring to anyone in particular, just sort of whether in conversation, there's a lot of, sexist conversation and racist conversation, those sorts of things. And it's just sort of, it's very normal here. It's very normalized here, racism and sexism. And many of these other isms, and I'm sure it is in other countries, but I just haven't heard a lot about it. And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about broadly some of the demographics of kind of Brazil, just to kind of give us some context for this work.
Okay, yeah, that's actually important because here in Brazil, in terms of race, Black people comprises the majority of the people, so we are 56% of the population.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's something that people, when they come to Brazil, they actually see it, but if they are not in Brazil and they consume media from Brazil, they will never think that because people on TV are white.
Yes,
so yeah, we have this very disproportionate rate of Black and white people in the media. Yeah. And another thing that I think it's important to mention is that race in Brazil is different than race in the United States, because for you, in the United States, it's based on ancestry, and here in Brazil is phenotype. So if you look at me, it's with the color of your skin or other features, the nose, your lips, the type of your hair, how curly it is. So if you look at me, and sometimes I do this when I'm abroad, and how do you describe me in terms of race? And people are like, oh, get scared. But I'm like, there's no pressure. How would you describe me? And usually they say you're a mixed race person. And my mom is actually white and my dad is Black. But, when people look at me, in Brazil, they see me as Black, like that's undeniable.
Sure.
Okay. But we have in Brazil a history of a myth that people in Brazil with all different races, they get along just fine. And then we have a lot of interracial relationships, and it's just bullshit, like it's just a big lie. But it has hindered people's identity, racial identities, because then we grow up in a world where we know we're not white, but we use other words to describe ourselves that it's just hard to even translate, like we usually grow up not using the word I'm Black or like Afro-Brazilian. We say words that are like I'm brown, and it's like you're acknowledging you're not white, but also you don't want to be regarded as Black because you know that Black people suffer in our country. And this just leads to a lessening of the amount of people that declares themselves as Black.
Oh, I see.
And so we have the Black movements fighting, throughout the years to make people more aware of that. And I think things are starting to change, but still, when we talk about race in Brazil, it's very hard. Like people don't want to talk about it. They deny that there is racism in Brazil. And it's just tough,
And did this just again for some more history? I think a lot of people understand sort of how the practices of kind of colonization and slavery brought I think most, if not all, Black people to North America, and that's where you got that ancestral kind of history piece there. Is that the same sort of story for Brazil? Is that sort of how folks came there? No.
I think that there's an important difference because so in the United States we have like the Jim Crow laws, we had the physical segregation, and this never happened in Brazil. So when slavery officially ended, we had Black people, dying basically, they were free, but they had no house, no money, no land. And so we were always able to be in the same environment, never a physical segregation, this is just for Black people and this is just for white people. It's like, no, this myth, everybody's together, but then you look and you see that white people are always in over here, the better positions. And if you're in a restaurant, then you see like Black people serving white people, and this repeats itself in most environments. This is another feature that hinders the racial identification, and racial pride, because we don't have, we grow up without learning about race and even having this feeling of pride that I think when I go to the United States and I talk to Black people, I feel like they're pride and they know their history. We don't know our history. I know a little bit because I'm studying this, and if I wasn't, I wouldn't know.
Before we were so rudely interrupted, we were just talking about. I was trying to get an understanding of sort of how, or kind of how Black history, I guess, essentially kind of began in Brazil, and so my understanding of North America is through slavery. That's what the white colonists brought the slaves to North America, and and then we kind of know that story from there, and and then eventually I know you referenced Jim Crow. So like in the U.S. we had the Jim Crow laws, which were basically slavery is abolished, but not really. Then Jim Crow was just another way to continue it, and I think there's been other things sort of since then that have just continued to perpetuate systematic anti-Black racism in North America. In South America, so and I was going to ask anyway. In South America, was there also slavery in South America?
Yeah.
In Brazil, so and
Yeah.
Black slavery in kind of the same way. And were these slaves brought by the same sort of way from Africa, from colonizing countries, and was it British, or was it more like Portuguese? So it was the Portuguese that brought the slaves over, and that's sort of where Brazil gets its Portuguese language. I see. Okay, and so then you were kind of saying that you didn't have the Jim Crow laws, but you just have segregation in other ways.
Yeah, we had a lot of laws actually. We didn't have Jim Crow, but we have laws that make it hard to Black people to buy land. We had laws that prohibited Black people to go to school, so like we don't have this formal physical segregation, but we have all other types of segregation that lead to very similar results.
Yeah. And so now maybe we'll start kind of getting into some of your papers here. And this is really what drew you to me. What drew me to you originally was seeing some of these topics, and it's been great to see some of these topics being written about in the U.S. And there's been some good stuff coming out, and I believe even some of the articles that you published were in journals that were kind of publishing. I don't know if your articles were in, like, I know there was an article. I'm mumbling this, but I'm fumbling this up. But essentially, there was a couple of series, I guess, that came out in behavior analysis and practice, in particular, on things related to police, and as well as on racism. And I think you published in at least one or a couple of those series, which is awesome. So let's talk about maybe the your work around feminism, and then we'll dive into the racism stuff, which I think is sort of most of the rest of the other research that I had an opportunity to read. How long is sort of maybe just a little bit brief history of kind of the feminist movement in Brazil? I know it's probably long, and there's could be lots of details and lots of examples, but just maybe a brief history of sort of kind of when it started and that sort of thing, and then kind of how it then became a behavior analysis thing in Brazil.
Okay, so every time I talk about feminism, I should have said that about everything, but I like to mention that when you're studying something, you're relying on like academic papers, and you have to remember like who was able to do that,
Right.
So yeah, I think it's an important note to have in mind. But
really is. We
have records of feminist discussions in Brazil, I think, growing stronger in the 60s, and we consume a lot of American feminist theorists, mainly. And so my understanding is that feminist studies in Brazil were heavily influenced by those theorists, and it began to change, of course, as everything does, when some people started to looking at our own reality, and we're like, yeah, but we have to look at what's the difference, like you're talking about United States and what we have that is different here in Brazil, and of course then other groups as well, noticing that most of the research on feminism is based on the lives of white women, middle class women, and things like that.
Yes.
But just to jump into like how behavior analysis relates to that. So what I know is that when I was still an undergrad, I had already this interest in feminism, but I still wasn't sure like how to study or how to look for that. And then I got into like student meetings and things like that. And only when I was in my master's that I went to, we have this annual behavior analysis conference in Brazil. And I've noticed that there were some women who were talking about feminism, you know, like presenting papers and things like that in those conferences. And it was, of course, it was great because there was this space, but then it was just limited to people who could afford the conference. And so we didn't have things written down, like we didn't have publications. It's just like very one or two things, you know, very sparsely throughout the years. And so a friend of mine, Renata Pinheiro, we're discussing, I mean, I think I discussed this in other environments, but we're noticing that it's just so hard because these discussions are so important, but they are in the conference and they die until the next year where we go to the conference again. And she was like, we should organize a book where we have these people who are talking about it, like we invite them to write it down, their ideas, like their research and things like that. And then this will be able, you know, like this will enable other people to get in touch with this literature because they were interested. Like I've talked to people who were interested in discussing this, but they were like, yeah, but I can't find anything on it. Like I want to study this, but how can I study this? And then that's how the idea for the book began. And we basically did that. Like we sat down and we wrote down the names of the women that we know that were talking about it and studying a little bit about it. And then we invited them and they written down like amazing papers. And then we had this book. And to this day, it's very, I mean, people still look for it, and it's still a reference for Brazilian behavior analysts.
This is the book, the Debates on Feminism Behavior Analysis book. I think it was 2019 maybe. You published there, and I assume that's in Portuguese.
It's in Portuguese.
Yeah.
If anybody who is listening and knows of a funding that allows us to translate the book to English or Spanish, let us know.
Lovely, yeah. No, that's. I'll make a note. That's great because there seems to be a lot of really cool works in Portuguese that you and your colleagues have written. That would be really cool to translate. So maybe we can find some of that. But you did but knowing that there's a gap there, you did publish this article in Behavior and Social Issues in 2021, entitled Behavior Analysis of Feminism, Contributions from Brazil. And the very first sort of sentence in the abstract, I'll just read it out here, it sort of speaks to your eagerness to kind of get this out beyond sort of Portuguese readers. This article presents non-Portuguese readers with developments regarding studies on the intersection between feminism and behavior analysis conducted in Brazil. This article in particular focused on two topics, empowerment and rape culture. This is quite the article. I think it really comes hard out of the gate, talking about some important topics. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe just because I was reading about sort of this. It sounds very what's the word I'm looking for? It's a good word. Very. I don't know. I think I would just love to have been a fly on the wall in this room because of this. You write about this group of feminist behavior analysts that got together in 2015 and kind of started a group. And it was based on the works of Maria del Rosario Ruiz. Is that right?
Well, in Spanish we say Maria del Rosario Ruiz.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. And who is she?
So,
who was she?
she was the main name of behavior. I mean, she was American behavior analyst who, when we started studying feminism, we only found pretty much papers that were written by her. You know, like she was like this island of knowledge within feminism, behavior analysis, and which was great, of course, but you know, like an island. So that's pretty tough. And then we're like, yeah, we have to expand this. Like, this is a huge start, and it, you know, like we need people to continue those debates. And actually, the paper, the behavior and social issues paper on feminism, it was as you were mentioning, like what I've noticed was that like I was trying to follow up with the literature on feminism and behavior analysis, and I've noticed, I mean, the literature in English, and I've noticed that here in Brazil we actually have more topics covered, you know, than in this literature. And I was like, oh my god, like I need to do something about it. And that's why I wrote it down. And as you mentioned, it was just 2 topics. Like there were a lot in the book. We talked about many things, you know, like we started talking about the history of Brazilian behavior analysis, the first female behavior analysis in Brazil. We talk about intersectional feminism. We talk about gender inequality, rape culture. You know, like there were a lot of topics, and I wasn't seeing them as developed when I was reading the English published literature. And I was like, oh, if we can't get the book translated, then I have to just tell people that there are things that are published. They're just not in English yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny you say that, because I think that was the other thing that drew me to these articles. Well, these were topics I had not read about in sort of other papers. I've read a bit about. I haven't read any of the things from Dr. Ruiz, but some of the stuff that I've read kind of more recently seems to be more focused on things like pay equity. There seems to be quite a few articles on pay equity, and some stuff on feminism. You know, within sort of academia in kind of the U.S. I know a recent article was, and I had her on the podcast, Dr. Natalia Baires, and she's doing some cool stuff. But again, she's very young, very relatively new to the field. So again, some of the stuff that's coming out now is really new, and so not surprising that. You know, they haven't hit on all these topics. This article is great because we'll share it in the show notes, because you know, it goes over a lot of really interesting topics. I mean, for the purposes of this interview, we won't get into sort of the empowerment and rape culture discussion. Again, the article really lays it out really nicely, and folks can give that a good read. But I wouldn't mind kind of scrolling a bit further down in the article, and maybe talking a little bit about the barriers for studying feminism, because I thought that was really important. And I think that, again, speaks to the context. You know, I think it sounds, after reading this, it makes sense why it's interesting that you have more topics in feminism, because that seems to be, you know, opposite to sort of these barriers, because there seems to be a lot less barriers in the US and Canada, and yet they haven't talked about all these great topics. But what are some of these barriers to sort of studying feminism for behavior analysis in Brazil?
So, in my understanding, as I put it on the paper, I think like language is one main barrier, because I think most of the literature is in other languages, especially like English or French, you know, and it's just hard. I mean, we are sometimes when you're talking with Brazilian people and you're like, oh, everybody speaks English, but it's not true at all, you know, like I don't have like very recent stats on that, but I remember that I found a statistic showing that like, I think 5% of the Brazilian population was able, you know, like had some knowledge of English. And you actually see that when you go on the streets, and like, I'm speaking English with you, but here in my neighborhood, like, I don't recall of anybody who could do that, you know, so We do have English classes in school, in public school, but they're not good, so we don't learn, and you have to pay to learn English. And most people don't have money to pay for English classes, you know? And so that's just a first huge barrier, because it is dependent upon having money. And a lot of people in Brazil don't have money. So even if a person goes out of her way to go into college, then she, you know, like gets this huge barrier that it's like you have to read in English, and the person doesn't know how to read in English.
Right.
And there are no classes of technical English for papers or things like that. So it's just hard, you know. And every time, like every topic that I'm studying, I always have this preoccupation of write down something in Portuguese, because that's where I live. That's, you know, like I'm talking about the Brazilian context. So even though we have like this pressure to publish in English, because we do, and there are huge pressures, I'm like, no, but this is for the Brazilian people, and I have to do something in Portuguese, or else I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. You know, I'm just producing, I'm just meeting up some standards. But it's hard, you know, because on the other part, you know, like we as researchers, we have this pressure to like, no, we have people who say like, if you publish in Portuguese, it doesn't count. And I think it's absurd to say that, you know, like, how can you say that? But it's hard. And then like English is really a huge barrier, because even with people who knows a little bit of English, you know, like it's different knowing a little bit of and reading an academic paper with a lot of technical terms and things like that. And I think the second one that I put it in is related to activism, because unfortunately, Brazil is a country that kills a lot of activists. So it was actually deemed like the champion. That's a horrible way to be a champion.
Yeah.
You know, like this is a country that kills most activists in the world. And it's just so sad, because we have this, you know, like we have this professor who studies gender, and she had to leave the country because she was being threatened. It's just crazy, you know, and this actually happens. We have records of activists being killed. So, I mean, yeah, sometimes they say, oh, if you're in an academic position, you can do activism, but it's less threatening. It's like, perhaps not. Like, we have a living example of a person who had to flee the country. You know, like, that's huge. That's awful. So I think those two are our main barriers when I think of like students and then professionals who work with this team and who wants to share these ideas to people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, those are huge barriers. I'm thinking about the language, number one. You know, it's interesting because I had noticed, you know, when I was reading some of these other articles, you know, I didn't see yours being cited, right? You know, in those articles, because they're in Portuguese. So these folks aren't able to read Portuguese, so they're not going to read your articles to kind of get that great information. Yeah, that's got to be quite the. I can't relate to it in any way, obviously, but it's got to be quite the sort of dilemma that you want to publish in Portuguese because that's your language, that's the language of your people, and you know, that's the language of your culture, and it has a lot of meaning. But if you want to be sort of recognized internationally, and if you want to collaborate internationally, you want to go to international conferences, you know, and I think you've done that. I know I definitely saw your name in last couple of years at some international conferences. But again, you're one of these rare folks that, you know, can speak English and you're able to disseminate that way. Yeah, I would imagine there's probably some relational frames happening right there where folks are thinking, oh, well, she speaks English, so they must all speak English, you know. So, you know, and so, you know, that's got to be a huge dilemma to balance, and it's not fair that, you know, you should have to learn English. Like, you know, I mean, in an ideal world, you know, some of these Americans could learn some Portuguese, you know. and that could be the way. There could be some, some sort of cross sharing. But I mean, I think we also know that Portuguese is up there in the difficult languages to learn. I've been told, at least. No, it's not so hard for you. But I've been told it's a tricky one. I don't think it's anything like Icelandic or Welsh, but it's not as simple as Spanish, as some folks would say Spanish is. I mean, not that Spanish is simple, but I think Spanish is related to a lot of other languages, and so it makes it easier to learn. Spanish is connected to French. There's lots of French speakers. It's connected to Italian in some ways, and so there's some similarity. I don't know much about languages, so I could be speaking out my ass here, but I know that there's some connections there, and so if you know some of those languages, even to English, it's easier, but Portuguese isn't so much. So that's got to be a huge barrier. But the activism thing is wild. Like, I mean, I think that's something we take for granted in Canada and the U.S. is that we definitely have some protests, and we've had some violent counter protests in recent times from some of the far right and the fascists and that sort of thing. But even then, in the end, the police come in and break it up. Well, to an extent, the police are also definitely a problem, but it's not. These people aren't getting killed, in the context of protesting. They're getting killed. People are getting killed, and that's why they're protesting. But they're not getting killed for activism. And so, yeah, I mean, and you've got a lot of. You've got a lot of big issues that you're writing about and talking about. And have you ever had sort of some fear of your own for your own safety by doing this work? Are you looking to up your organization's governance game? Or maybe you need support to design interventions that have long-term sustainability. The British Columbia Association for Behaviour Analysis will be hosting their 15th annual conference on March 3rd and 4th. The first day will be 2 virtual keynote sessions from Dr. Ramona Homenfar, who will be speaking on values-based governance, and Louis Bush with a presentation on designing function-based treatments that withstand the test of time. Remember, these will be virtual keynotes, so you can attend from anywhere around the world. If you're going to be in Vancouver that weekend, BCABA's second day will feature live presentations from local presenters, a poster session, and multiple network opportunities. For more information and to register, go to www.bcaba.org and click on the Events tab. That's bc-aba.org. Hope to see you there. The second secret word is stereotype.
Yes. I cannot say that I have. I mean, because it's always, like, we are already from a minoritized group or minoritized groups. And sometimes when you're speaking about those issues, you don't have anybody to back you up, So you're just like, you're an island. You're talking about something that is very important to you, that like you have loads of data supporting it. And you feel lonely because people look at you and be like, oh, is that so hard? Like, oh, is that really a problem? Like, it's awful, and you fear, I mean, I don't think I've ever feared for my life for writing about these things, like the papers, but I have a personal fear of like not getting a job, because I actually, like, when we are in conferences, we hear people looking at us and saying like, this is not research, like what you're doing is just bullshit, you're never gonna get a job, and like big important people saying those things,
Wow.
So it's hard, it's dangerous, but if you don't do it, then like it's just so hard, because if you don't do it, nothing's gonna change, and if you do it, perhaps it's going to change, but there's all of those risks attached to it, So we tend to, like think about, oh, is this worthwhile doing right now? And sometimes I just shut up and don't say anything just to protect myself. But at other times I'm like, yeah, I think like I have to say this.
Yeah. And I mean, and Brazil, and I don't want to get too much into politics here, but Brazil, up until recently, you had is it a president? Is that what they call it in Brazil? So you had a president that was, a lot like our last, a lot like the not ours, but the U.S.'s last president, and and they were kind of best friends in some ways, and I mean, you don't again, we didn't hear you don't hear a lot in the news about kind of what's happening. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I heard in the news related to that fella was just taking down the Amazon, bit by bit, and and essentially destroying the last, it's destroying one of the most important contributors to sort of protecting our planet from climate change. But of course, this is a populist president that probably didn't believe in climate change, so that was easy enough to do. And obviously, with a president, with sort of a president like that, and sort of more kind of right wing kind of extremist kind of thinking, there had to be even more of a fear, and probably a lot more activists were probably have died sort of in the last, I don't know how long he was in power, but for the last several years that he was in power, it's probably been quite scary, I imagine, eh?
Yeah. I mean, he was basically a public, very important person, authorizing people to say awful things, to minority groups. It was basically that. It was very scary all the time. It was really scary, and most of my friends were as well. Like people that I know that work with social justice things, they're all scared all the time.
Yeah. And again, I know very little about the politics, but is the new leader a turn for the better?
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference. It was a huge relief. Of course, he's not perfect, but I mean, it was a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, folks really need to read this article. Anyone interested in anything related to social justice, and I know I've got a lot of listeners that are interested in social justice. I've had a lot of guests that are interested in social justice, and so I hope they pick up this paper and reach out to you to collaborate. I want to talk about this other article. I don't know if we're going to get into all the articles that you sent me. You sent me some great ones. I'm going to share all of them in the show notes, even if we don't talk about them today, because like I said, Táhcita has published, and her colleagues have published some really cool articles on a lot of areas related to social justice, particularly related to racism. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get into all of them today, but I do want to talk about the other one that speaks to contributions from Brazil. And that's another article also published. I guess was this published in the same?
Yeah.
In the same issue?
Yeah.
Oh, it was. Okay, I was just reading. Did I read that wrong? Yeah. So published in the same issue as the Feminism article was an article entitled "Racial Issues and Behavior Analysis: Experiences and Contributions from Brazil," and that's by you and three of your colleagues. Two I think I've heard you mention already today. Tell me a little bit about kind of why you wrote this article, and maybe kind of some of the highlights would be cool.
Okay, so I think it was pretty much a similar concern within the feminism literature. Yeah. I knew that there were some pretty cool things happening here. So, for instance. That's not to brag, but I had this paper published in 2017 with my former supervisor. There was a summary of the contributions of behavior analysis when dealing with racism, racial issues in general. Yeah. And then it was published in Portuguese. And then 3 years later, there were a paper very similar, but published in English. And of course, probably the author couldn't read the paper in Portuguese, or didn't even had access to it. And then I was thinking, oh, there was 3 years later and they're talking about the same things we were already talking. If they knew what we were doing, perhaps they were able to improve it, think about other things and broaden, I don't know, something like that. And so I was seeing some things published in Portuguese that were not discussed in English, and I was like, I have to tell this to people, you know. So I think, I mean, a little bit was already published, so I thought the paper mentioned 4 contributions, and the first one are the behavior analytic accounts of racial prejudice and pretty much the literature on stimulus equivalence. So there was already published in English. And so we had like my studies and a study by Marilia, who's also from Brazil. Something that was new was a study that was carried out here in Brazil that was looking at stereotype threat. And trying to relate it to behavior analysis. And I thought this was just great because stereotype threat is a phenomenon that is widely studied. You know, like when you look at social psychology, you have so many papers on it. And every time that I was reading about it, I was like, this is stimulus control, this is stimulus control. But I never thought like, I'm going to write about this. And then this guy did that, you know, like he actually tried to look at how to understand stereotype threat using relational frame theory. So like the relations that are established, stimulus control basically. And he also had like an experimental. So he carried out, I think, 4 studies or 5 studies. And it was pretty cool when I was reading. And I was like, oh, we don't have that in English. So I have to tell people that this exists, you know, and so that people can know. And perhaps, of course, like not just get to know, but do something about it, you know. And the stereotype threat is a topic that I'm very interested because when you look at literature, you see that very small changes are able to enhance the performance of students. And I always think to myself, like, why don't professors use this all the time? I mean, if they knew about this, if they were trained about this, some simple instructions, some simple words that sometimes you say and you don't have to say it, you know, like very, very, very small changes can do so much for the students, like not to feel anxious, not to feel like they're being evaluated. And I just had to, you know, like I just wanted to tell people about it.
What is stereotype threat? Can you just tell me a little bit what that means?
Okay. Yeah, I should have mentioned this already. So stereotype threat is the name given to a phenomenon that is widely assessed in the literature that shows that the performance of an individual can be impaired depending on some environmental features. So like we have this classic study that had white and black students do a simple task that wasn't really measuring anything, but the instruction said that, well, now I don't remember exactly, but pretty much like if the instruction mentioned something about the race of the students, then black students performed worse than white students. And this was actually, what is the word I'm looking for? Replicated with gender, you know, like when it gender with other races, you know, like Asian students and white students. So like it's a hugely studied phenomenon, and it was replicated with a lot of different features. And it's that, you know, like if you don't say, like if you say something like, this does not mean that you were dumb or something like that, you know, like students perform better, you know. If you don't say that this is related to their race or this means that they're not good, you know, some very, very, very small changes and instruction in environmental cues can make a performance vary wildly.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time to bring in, because it does actually sound very behavior analytic if you start to think about it, you know, a little bit. And I know that you go on. It's D'Souza, I believe, that's talking a lot about this, about sort of kind of how RFT fits in here. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because this little section here, by the way, again, for folks that maybe aren't all that familiar with RFT, this little 3-paragraph section here in this article is a great little intro to RFT, because it really takes this whole idea and conceptualizes it in through RFT, and it's really just interesting. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about how RFT and stereotype threat are related, or conceptualized, I guess.
Okay. Am I going to speak or you?
Yes, you are. Yes, thank you. Yes. Sorry, that was the question. So
Okay.
the RFT piece in there. Yeah.
Okay. Should I first define or just like jump into it?
Well, sure. Let's define. Yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, that's a lot to talk. So let's first talk about like stimulus equivalence, and then we go to other relations. Okay. So what this author is like, the analysis this author made was that if there's like an equivalence relation between an individual's group and a negative attribute, there's this possibility that the effects of the stereotype threat will happen, like we can actually see this consistent, and literature actually shows that, So what he says is that if you have a situation where the context is signaling you two relations, so first a relation between the individual and their group, and then their group and the task, you actually have, the relation between this individual and the task as a consequence of those two other relations, So when we talk about relational frame theory, we're just like expanding this, not to just equivalence, but other relations as well.
But what I wouldn't mind, so I think again, this is just another nice article that's written in English, that sort of outlines some of the contributions of Brazilian behavior analysts to racism, and then the other one to feminism. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the one article though that you were involved with. Well, there's a few actually. Like for example, I know you talked about the I think it was 2016 or 2017 article. That was the one around trying to changing bias a bit there, and then I know we've seen some other ones. I mean, I did an interview with Vic Suarez. I think it was episode like 19 or 20 or 21 or something, and she did a similar article on trying to sort of use it. I think she's used a computer program and then used some of those implicit bias measures, and then tried to sort of basically, I think quite similar, using stimulus equivalence to sort of see if she could affect change in bias, and I think we're seeing a few more of those coming out. I don't, and my guess is they probably don't reference yours, but maybe they will going forward. But I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the police stops article, the racial prejudice in police stops article. I think that's a really interesting one. And speaks to, I think it's relatable, I think, for a lot of the listeners, because there's been a lot of conversation around, police brutality and particularly, Black people feeling, essentially, unsafe in the presence of police in any way, certainly in the US. And so just hearing about sort of how this plays out kind of in another country alone, I think would be quite interesting. But maybe also giving us a bit of context on how maybe police kind of differ in Brazil than maybe other countries. You have this military police sort of regime.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be hard to compare because I don't really know how it actually works in other countries.
Just your perspective on it, and then folks can compare in their minds.
So actually, this paper was a second paper. We actually started with a different paper that was published in Portuguese that we actually were doing. So just let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
So, I started studying racial bias because I wanted to study racial issues, but also I started with racial bias because starting with racism seemed a lot because it's way more complex. So I started with this smaller thing, you know, like talking about interpersonal relations.
Yeah.
And then after I studied this for a while, I wanted to expand a little bit and trying to look at racism and like institutional racism and things like that. And that's where the police comes in. So we actually, like, I had this professor helping me, Angelo Sampaio, who's just great, and I love him. And he works a lot up with what's the word I'm looking for? Like, he works a lot with culture, you know, like, so macro contingencies, meta contingencies, and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is something that I know that I knew at a time that I had to learn, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go there and study under him for a while, so then I can learn a little bit about it. And so we did this paper first. There was an analysis, so we tried to use meta contingencies, macro contingencies to understand the police in Brazil and institutional racism. So things like we have these indicators of institutional racism when you look at, for instance, the number of Black and white people that are incarcerated, or the number of like when you look at penalties, like the number of years, the type of consequence that is given to people, you know, like sometimes, the white person is like, that's okay, that there was nothing, and then the Black person goes to jail. So we had all of these indicators, and we're trying to look at how does this look from a behavior analytic perspective, you know, like apart from, of course, we can do this analysis one by one, you know, like using antecedents, behavior, and consequences. But when you look at culture, like how, when you talk about groups, we have this result, and then we have this first paper. And the second paper that you were mentioning was actually then continuing, you know. So we were like, okay, now we have some theoretical understanding of how this happened, and it's good, and is focused on the Brazilian context. And then we're like, okay, but let's look at the literature to see one of the actions the police does, you know, like police stops in this case, and then just, you know, like review this, because we didn't have this data at the time. And then let's look at the literature and see how the police stops can relate to racial prejudice or racism, institutional racism. And then one of the students, this is actually a study that I co-supervised, and so Aline is the main researcher. And we were looking at the literature, and if you read just like the abstract, you see like we didn't found papers in Portuguese, which already tells us a lot, you know, like, and that's actually an issue. When we talk about racial relations in Brazil, the lack of data is an issue, because we have constantly people not collecting data, you know, separated by race. So it's like we can't do like, it's like if you don't have the data, you can't prove that this is happening, you know. So it was a shame. I mean, of course, it was important, and we actually got to look. We got studies from, I think most of them were from like United States, and then in England and Wales and the Netherlands, but like none from Brazil, you know. But all of them were pretty much showing us that the actions of the police, you know, like we have these different names, police stop or stop and freeze, you know, that varies. But what we see is that if there is a Black person, this person is more likely to be stopped by the police, you know, like this person is more likely to have a bad consequence of that encounter. And even if this person like has nothing to do with anything, you know, like she's just like driving somewhere, it is a discriminative stimulus for a police to just stop this person, and I don't know, imagine this person is a criminal and things like that. It's just very sad, actually. It's not different in Brazil. Like, we were looking at the results, and it actually happens a lot in Brazil, even though we don't always have data. But it's just really sad, you know. And we're thinking, there was actually a paper that was published in this like collection of racially guided studies. They were trying to develop strategies to change the behaviors of police officers, like, for instance, like, if you put a camera on them, like, would this lead them to reduce the number of times they go to a Black person to frisk them, and so I think it was like the first we wanted this picture, so then we can think about the strategies and like how, now that we have this data, how can we deal with it, like how can we change that, because it's clearly showing us that this is racism, like there's no other explanation. And now it's nice to see like that there's already a paper trying to figure that out, like how can we change that, but we need more strategies, and especially strategies not only aiming at like reducing these, but looking at actually the structure, like the structural racism within society, like regardless if you're talking about Brazil or United States or Canada or other countries, like how can you tackle this looking at the structure? And that's like the hardest question ever.
Yeah. I don't think I realized when I was reading this that none of the papers actually came from Brazil. That this was a review of sort of everywhere else. So obviously you don't have the data, but I mean, just for a little bit of context, and really it can only really be sort of anecdotal and maybe personal experience. But is it likely the same or worse, sort of in Brazil as far as sort of how, Black people are treated by police? Do Black people grow up, sort of being afraid of police? And all that sort of thing?
It's hard to say like if it's the same or worse.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Black people grew up fearing the police, and we actually see some huge differences. So, for instance, like myself and my sisters, like both women, and like I'm Black, my sister is white, and I grew up and I learned from early on that I have to have like my ID with me at all times, because to this day we have this law in Brazil that was actually really enforced right after slavery, that can arrest a person if like, it's hard to translate this, but we have like this term vadiagem, but it's mean like to be, if you're able to work and you're not working, and you didn't have a document to prove that you were employed somewhere, they just like put the person behind bars. And this law is still like, it's still happening in Brazil. I don't think it happens as it was right after slavery ended, but it is a preoccupation, like if you are more likely to be stopped by the police, then you need to have your document. And I always carry my university ID, because they treat me differently when they see.
Of course.
Yeah. When they see like, oh, you're a psychologist, or you're doing your Ph.D. and things like that, like I can see that it changes the way they are treating me. Like at first it's like, oh, I'm very scared. And then when they look, they're like, oh, you're a psychologist. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, okay. So you can go, so I've learned from early on to have my ID, and all of my Black friends as well, especially the men, because there's also like this gender difference. And my sister and other white people that I've talked about, like sometimes we go out, and they're like, oh, I don't even have my ID, and I'm like, oh my God, how are you here without it? Like I get preoccupied, and they're like, what are you worried? I'm like, what if the police talk to you? And I'm like, yeah, the police is not gonna do that to you. So it's just like we laugh, but it's, oh my God, it's just harsh,
It's so ingrained,
yeah. It's just like, just part of the reality is just, you don't even think about it, and then you have to, you don't go through that. And we actually see, like I have friends that were like on a bus, for instance, and then the police goes to the bus, and like, this is a white friend of mine, and he was with Black colleagues, and then the policeman look at the white man and say like, okay, you wait. And then he was like searching like the clothes and and looking at the Black colleagues to see if they were carrying something. So like it's clear that the way they're treating us is differently. Like they don't even try to hide it.
Did the when George Floyd was murdered, obviously lots of things happening in the U.S. that were different, and it definitely resonated in Canada. Did the George Floyd murder, sort of have any ripple effects down in Brazil, or was it just sort of another story from the States?
Oh, that's a very difficult to answer question because
just like again, just even from your own perspective, I know again because you don't have data, and it's so hard when you don't have data.
But so like this brought a movement to Brazil. I think that's undeniable.
Okay.
There were a lot more people talking about race issues in Brazil, and race relations and things like that, and doing discussions. But I feel like it doesn't last. Like we had like not long ago, not like a month ago, a person here in Brazil, like a white, a Black woman, who's like the police officer like stepped on her neck. I doubt that you've heard about this.
No.
So yeah, like these things also happen in Brazil. It doesn't get that much media coverage.
Sure.
I mean, it is really important that the things happening in the United States or whatever place gets here, of course.
Yeah.
But it's like, like it, for me, the message is like, yeah, we're worried, but we're not that worried because it's happening here, like, what are we doing to change that? Like, people talk about it and they're like, oh, racism is bad and things like that, but they don't do anything to change that. So it's hard, like we have, of course, like the Black movements and other small groups are fighting all the time, like to change the situation. And at the same time, where the power is, people are like, yeah, that doesn't concern me. So it's hard actually.
Yeah. I know we're getting close to wrapping up here. I know you got to get going to another meeting. I'm wondering, maybe you could just tell folks kind of what kind of projects you're working on right now. And related to that, I know one of your papers, and you've said this a few times, and one of your papers also talks about sort of the importance of more international collaboration. And so maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on now, but also, how can people get a hold of you, and what kinds of things would you like to sort of collaborate on?
Okay. So right now I'm studying racial microaggressions and gender racial microaggressions, who can be defined as like racial slurs, like insults that are often deemed as non-intentional, but have real effects, negative effects on people of color, on Black people. So I'm studying this intersection of gender and race, focusing on Black women. Because I think we need more studies about ourselves. And it's been actually very interesting because I'm reviewing the literature in this moment. And again, like there's almost nothing in Portuguese about this. And we have a huge population of Black women in Brazil. Like we are pretty much like 25% of the population. And if you look at literature on Black women, like it's just so scarce, like very little things being published, very few things being published. But so my focus now is going to compare two universities in Brazil, like one that is Black, that has this proposition of being a Black university, which is new in Brazil. Like it's not like the United States that has historically Black universities, and then comparing to, it could be any university really, but one of the widest universities we have. And so I'm trying to see like if there are going to be differences in the gender racial microaggressions these women experience being in those two very different environments.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah. So I'm pretty excited about that. And regarding collaboration, I'm pretty much open to anything that has to do with social justice, really, but especially if it's related to like autism, but with this critical approach, or if we're talking about intersections of autism and gender or race and things like that. Racial issues, of course, feminism. So I think, and gender and sexuality, that are like, I think they're the main topics that I'm interested in talking about and collaborating. And I've actually had some, they're not plans actually, they're already collaborations in progress, you know, like writing a paper right now with a researcher from Ireland and another one from United States, which is going to be interesting in talking about gender and behavior analysis. And let me check, because I don't remember everything, but there's something I think it's important to mention. So I should have prepared this.
It's okay.
If I get like 10 minutes or 15 minutes late, I hope it's not a problem. I don't think it'll be a problem. I'll tell people like it's all my fault.
Okay.
So it's a special issue that I'm organizing with other people. I'm just trying to remember the details so I can talk about it. Okay, yeah. So this is actually a call for papers on behavior analysis in practice on impactful leaders, Latin American women in behavior analysis.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if Natalia mentioned that. I don't remember when she was in the podcast. So the guest editors are, you know, like Natalia Byres, and I don't know where I'm saying Byres with an American accent. I should say Natalia Byres, Sebastián Garcia Zambrano, and I'll be one of the associate guest editors. So I think it's a pretty interesting chance to, if you're from Latin America, and to talk about the important work we're doing here. And if you know anybody who is interested in submitting, the call is open until April. So,
okay, perfect.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, awesome. We'll share that around, and hopefully maybe when that gets done and comes out, maybe I could even have you and Natalia back on to talk about that. That'd be really
great.
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Really cool. I'm so glad we finally got to have you on and to share this work. Something I'd like to do, if you're into it, and if you're not, I'll edit it out. But is, I don't know if you know, but right now it's February 2023, and I put a bunch of episodes out from the podcast, and I'm offering free CEUs for them for Black History Month. I thought it might be cool to try to publish this episode this week, if I can. Normally I wait like 6 months to publish, but to publish it this week and also give free CEUs for it. So that way more folks will listen and we can get the word out from Brazil to more people that way. Whereas if they have to pay, they're less likely to listen. And so I can make this one of the free ones too. Would you be into that?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So my goal will be to get it out this Friday. If not, I'll definitely get it out next Friday. It'll just depend on our little editing glitch with the recording and making that work. But if I can make it happen, then it'll be out this Friday. Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Táhcita, for coming on. This has been awesome, and I'm hoping to have you on again in the future.
Thank you. I'll be glad to be back.
Right on. All right. The third secret word is feminism.